So my name is Professor Paul Readman and I come from King's College London.
And tell me, what's your interest in pageants in particular? Axbridge, I suppose, is one of the ones that you must be following.
Well, I've been interested in pageants for a very long time actually, well at least 15 years I think. And I got interested in them because I was curious about the way in which people tried to reenact the history of their communities before the First World War. And it was before the First World War that people were said to have caught pageant fever, pageantitis. And that was the time when I suppose people started reenacting their past history through historical pageants. It started at Sherborne in Dorset. So it was very surprising to know that in 1967 Axbridge sort of revived the tradition by having a pageant to mark the construction of the A371 Axbridge Bypass Road. So Axbridge sort of came late into the pageant tradition, but is now, I think, the best example of the pageant tradition in action today in Britain. And I've been interested in pageants because I've run a project for the last I suppose 5 or 6 years, trying to document all the pageants that have taken place across Britain since 1905 when they started in Dorset, and I suppose we've catalogued about 600 or 700 separate pageants. And of the pageants that are going after 1945, Axbridge really is, I suppose, the best example of the pageant tradition alive today.
Have they changed since 1905 in the way they interpret history?
I think so. The early pageants very much focused on the medieval past, and they tended to culminate in scenes of Elizabethan merrymaking, typically involving Queen Elizabeth arriving into the town that was holding the pageant, even if there was no record of Queen Elizabeth actually having visited the town in historical record, in historical fact, if you like. And they finished then, so they finished in the 16th century, sometimes in the 17th century. More recent pageants, and Axbridge is an example, tends to pay more attention to the more recent past. So in one way they've changed because they've taken the whole sweep of history. They've not stopped in the 16th century or the 15th century. That's one way they've changed. Another way they've changed is that they have tended to I suppose take on board more controversial aspects of history, to be less inclined to avoid depicting scenes of community tension and that kind of thing. So they've changed a bit. They've become less dialogue heavy, I think. The early pageants were very heavy with dialogue, even though people who were listening to the pageants couldn't possibly have heard them because there was no amplified sound in 1905 when the pageant tradition got going, so people would have followed the pageant with a book of words. Now there is amplified sound, or at least a bit of amplified sound, or at least there is amplified sound. So they have changed in that respect. So they become slicker, they become more professional in some respects, but in others they've stayed quite true to form. And in some, I think Axbridge is unusual in that its reliance on volunteer labour, if you like, is quite true to the original tradition of pageantry, as it was established in the early 20th century. Vast armies of volunteer performers, or large armies of volunteer performers. So in that respect, the Axbridge pageant is similar to earlier pageants. In other respects, it's somewhat different, not least because it takes account of history after about the 16th century.